Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Meet the Expert session. I am Carlos Beck-Viana. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for CAST, the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. CAST is a nonprofit that connects scientists, communicators, and organizations to deliver credible science-based information on food, agriculture, and the environment. If you'd like to explore our publications or become a CAST member, please visit us at cast-science.org. And be sure to follow us on social media. We are at Cast Ag Science everywhere. So thank you so much for being here with us today for this special session with Matt Baur, Director of the Western Integrated Pest Management Center. Matt will share his journey as an entomologist and his work on invasive species and wildfire resilience. Now I'm pleased to hand things over to today's moderator, Dr. Joe Schroeder, a respected weed scientist and a longtime CAST collaborator. Welcome, Jill, and it's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Carlos. I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have the opportunity to introduce Matt today. He grew up in Los Angeles, California, and completed his undergraduate work in biology at the University of California, San Diego. He went to the University of Kentucky then to do his graduate work on the foraging ecology of parasitic wasps. After his graduate work, he postdoced and worked at the University of California and worked on entomopathogenic nematodes. Easy for me to say as a weed scientist, right? From there, he went to Louisiana State University, where he worked on row crop entomology. And after 10 years, he went to Massachusetts to begin his own work as an independent crop consultant. He's still doing that to a certain extent today. He took a position during that time at DuPont Pioneer and worked on transgenic soybean products for the South American market. In 2014, Matt joined the Western IPM Center in Davis, California as Associate Director. And as Carlos said, he is now the director of the center. He's been a prolific author in both peer-reviewed and extension publications, and is a member of the Entomology Society of America, as well as some other societies. I have to say I've known Matt for at least 10 years. It's hard to figure out when we first got introduced, but we had an opportunity over those 10 years to spend a lot of time discussing issues related to integrated pest management and agriculture and land management as a whole. We had the opportunity to work together in 2017 for the release of the CAST publication, Crop Protection Contributions Towards Agricultural Productivity. So Matt has been a longtime CAST supporter and contributor to activities at CAST. I've had the chance to work with him more directly over the last few years. And I have to say, I've totally enjoyed our discussions and our activities together. Matt brings a very broad background into all of the conversations that we have. And he's an excellent communicator, but more importantly, he's an excellent listener. He tries to bring in a very broad perspective on the issues that he's considering or that the center is considering, and really takes the time to understand other people's points of view or contributions that they can make to the conversation. So with that, I'm happy to turn the mic over to Matt, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say today. Thanks, Matt, for doing this.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks for that very kind introduction. So, as my name's Matt Baur, I'm at the Western IPM Center, and the title of my talk is Practiced in the Art of IPM. Jill, I can't actually see because my screen is taken up by the slides. Are my slides projecting okay?
Yes, they are.
Great, thanks. So what do I mean by practiced in the art of integrated pest management? I, like many others, was trained up in IPM during my college career when I took classes in integrated pest management. And that's actually been one of the big successes of integrated pest management over the years. And that is that many of our pest management professionals in all the disciplines that we normally associate with pest management are, in fact, trained up during their college careers on integrated pest management principles. And so that's really a really positive thing because many of our practicing pest management professionals in the field today are trained in IPM. But in addition to that, I've also worked over the last 30 years in both the public and private sectors on pest management issues. And although I'm trained up as an entomologist, um, because I've been in practice for so long, I've had to deal with issues in weed science as well as plant pathology, oftentimes dealing with some vertebrate pests as well. So, like many integrated pest management professionals, although we're trained in one specific discipline associated with pest management, we oftentimes have a broad experience across the different disciplines. So I'm going to talk about, as Carlos mentioned, I'm going to talk about three things here today. One is my own journey, my own background, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western Integrated Pest Management Center. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the upcoming CAST manuscript, which will be published later this year, that focuses on weeds and wildfires across the nation. So a question I get a lot is, how did you become an entomologist? And the way I oftentimes answer this is this way. Like many other kids that I deal with over the course of a variety of different activities, I was interested in insects and specifically spiders when I was small. As a matter of fact, I can't even really begin to tell you when this interest started. Um, and it's always been an interest of mine. And it's, again, like a lot of other kids, that's where this all started, was with this interest from a very young age in insects and especially spiders. When I got to be a little bit older, what I started to be very interested in was foraging ecology. How do animals find their food? So I love animal behavior. It's something that I've always been interested in. And what I, not surprisingly, as a young male who's always interested in food, I was interested in how these organisms negotiate their environment and find their food. So as a young boy, I would oftentimes sit there and write in my diary about the spiders around our house and how they were identifying their food sources. As an undergraduate at UC San Diego, I did a project on trying to measure the endurance of wolf spiders. Wolf spiders are a little bit different from orb weavers in the sense that they don't spin a web to find their food. They usually just wind up hunting on foot. That project didn't go great. It wasn't necessarily the best experimental design, but okay, it was a learning experience. And then at the University of Kentucky, I started studying parasitic Hymenoptera. So Hymenoptera are bees and wasps, and wasps, many of the wasps we normally think of are predatory. So you think of yellow jackets or mud daubers, but there's this large contingent of wasps, of the wasp grouping, that are parasitic. And so they use those stingers not as protection, like what we think of in terms of bees and some of the yellow jackets, but they actually use them to lay eggs in their hosts. And that's what you can see in that picture, kind of in the top right, where you've got a wasp riding on top of a caterpillar. That wasp is now attempting to lay an egg inside that caterpillar. So having an interest in foraging ecology, and specifically with some of these organisms that we normally think of as being natural enemies, these are organisms that wind up preying on other insects in this case, it really lended itself quite well to transfer into interest in integrated pest management. So one of the underlying ecological principles of integrated pest management is shown here on the right in the figure. You've got population size on the y-axis and time over the x-axis, and the blue line gives you exponential growth. So this is oftentimes what we predict a population will do if it's not resource limited or limited in any other way. But that's not oftentimes what we see. What we see is more like the orange line, which is what we call logistical growth. And this line depicts what a population does in an environment where resources might become limited, where there's competition, and where there are natural enemies. So, and these are other organisms that will use that population as a resource. They'll either prey on the population or they'll parasitize the population. And so understanding how that natural enemy guild functions and forages and finds its prey is integral to biological control, which is a big part of integrated pest management. This is kind of the way I think of integrated pest management, like the Swiss Army knife. I know Swiss Army knives used to be something commonplace. I think maybe they are less commonplace today. So maybe I will have to rethink, I will have to find a new analogy. But for the time being, this is the one I'm using. And the idea here is that we're using all the various tools available to us to try and control or to manage these pest populations that are affecting human beings in a negative way. And biological control is definitely one of those tools. Again, the idea here in IPM is that we're trying to figure out a way to use all these things in concert so that one tool is not negatively affecting another tool, so not contraindicated. Now, integrated pest management has been around for a really long time, about 6 decades. It started back in the 1950s in California with Vern Stern out at Berkeley. I apologize, this timeline actually goes backward. It goes from right to left. That's a little counterintuitive, and I apologize about that. I will have to fix this slide the next time I give this talk. But in the 1950s, folks started to look at some of these natural enemy guilds as ways that we could manage the populations. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, we have the publication of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's seminal book, as well as the establishment of the EPA. And here, the highlighted aspect of some of these management issues was on over-reliance on chemical controls. So Silent Spring highlighted the issue of off-target and off-site effects of some of these chemical controls that we were using, which is still an issue that we're facing today. And then we also started talking a lot about resistance. So chemical controls, pesticides, are very similar to other selective factors in the environment in that organisms will adapt to those selective pressures and eventually figure out ways to overcome them. And so that's what we started to see as well. And so the idea was really born here that we should really be thinking about chemical management as integrated with all these other management tools that we have at our disposal. And we should be really thinking about how to develop those things in union, in concert. The first IPM manuals were published in California in the 1980s. And then the integrated pest management centers were conceived in year 2000. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western Integrated Pest Management Center. This is our vision, a healthier West with fewer pests, and how we are attempting to achieve that vision is through smart, safe, and sustainable pest management. So there are 4 regional IPM centers throughout the nation. We are highlighted there in blue. We cover 13 states as well as the territories in the Pacific Islands. There's also a North Central center, one in the Northeast and one in the South. Now, this regional model for addressing pest management issues is not specific to pest management. We also see this for a variety of other programs that are funded through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We see this for the Sustainable Agriculture effort, which is the SARE program. They are also organized in regional programs, as well as the IR4 program, which is the Interregional Project 4, which doesn't mean a lot to most folks, but what they are principally working on is identifying pest management solutions for specialty crops. And so this regional approach has been broadly used, and it really works very effectively because many of the issues that we're dealing with are broadly speaking applicable to the entire nation, but there are specific aspects of each issue in in each of the different regions that can really only be addressed in a regional way. And so the regional programs have been especially useful in doing that. However, the centers, the IPM centers, have sort of these overriding goals, which are common to all four centers. The first is to coordinate research and extension efforts. So we are in the business of building IPM widgets, and I will talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. We also facilitate collaboration across states and disciplines. And importantly, what we do is we support the Integrated Pest Management Network. And what I mean by the network, each state has an IPM program with an IPM coordinator, and the centers are support that network of folks and programs by providing oftentimes maybe meeting space or providing other support aspects so that those programs can be successful and can interact effectively. So I did say that we are in the business of producing widgets. This is the way we do this by providing funding. Funding is shown on the y-axis, and then this is sort of a project timeline going all the way from planning and proof of concept all the way to actually implementing that widget and studying the impact of it. Our funding is goes up to about $40,000, and we are funding things that are at that front end of the project timeline. So work groups, assembling people to develop an idea, project initiation, which develops the data set to develop, to basically prove that this concept has merit, as well as planning documents and special issues. And then in essence, the big bulk of the research where you need the big dollars, 3 years, $300,000, those are oftentimes funded directly through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture through the Crop Protection Pest Management Program, as well as the Specialty Crops Research Initiatives and through AFRI, which is the Agriculture Food Research Initiative funding area. And then we will oftentimes fund at the back end as well when folks are busy developing their outreach tools, as well as studying the implementation or the adoption of some of these programs or widgets, as well as studying the economic impacts. So we provide support for that as well. And then I don't have, so this was the best example I could think of how the Integrated Pest Management Center supports the IPM network. So we have a variety of widgets or tools that are available to us. Many of those tools, or not many, but certainly some of those tools are developed by the IR4 program, but also by us and through the land-grant universities. And so those new tools or widgets have to oftentimes be registered through federal agencies like the EPA. And then the Western Center is involved in pulling information from the IPM network that then when registration review comes up, that we are involved in providing information for that registration review. So you could see how in this case, the IR4 project as well as the Western project, Western IPM Center are involved together in developing some of these new tools, as well as making sure that those new tools continue to be available to our practitioners. So the last thing I'm going to talk about today is weeds and wildfires, and this is the manuscript, the upcoming manuscript from CAST, where we assembled a group of experts to develop not only develop ideas around policy issues when it comes to weeds and wildfires across the nation, but also look at some of the management tools and some case studies. And what I've got in this slide is, I thought, kind of interesting. These were some slides that I got from Raylene Crandall in Florida, and these are some of the old wildfire posters, wildfire prevention posters that used to be displayed around the country. And what's important here is to understand kind of what this displays, and that was that in the past, we often thought of wildfire as being something that we needed to prevent at all costs. And of course, now we're really starting to understand much better that this is probably maybe not the best way to do this. Now, admittedly, we don't want just anybody going out there and setting fires, because that's a bad thing. But preventative or prescribed burning has become a much bigger part of our management strategy in some of the forestries forested areas, as well as some of the wildland areas across the nation. And so it's becoming increasingly important for us to understand that fire can be a tool for us. We just have to understand how to use it. And complete prevention of all fires is probably not the best thing. But as what we're experiencing in the West, what we're seeing is increased frequency and intensity of fires associated with some of the invasive plants that are now starting to dominate large swaths of the West. So, for instance, here we've got the Great Basin, which is historically dominated by sagebrush, and that conversion to grassland. So, for instance, if you look at the image on the far left, what you can see is the Great Basin, which spans, in essence, California through Nevada to Utah and then up into Idaho and eastern Oregon. That is predominantly dominated by sagebrush, or has been historically, which does burn, but it doesn't burn at a very high frequency or at a very high intensity. And from going from yellow to red, you can see sort of the increasing encroachment of invasive annual grasses, some of the bromes, things like Medusa head, also cheatgrass, and then some of the additional invasive grasses like Medusa head and goat grass. And as those plants start to start to dominate the habitat, the environment at larger and larger areas, what we see is that the risk of fire also starts to increase. So on the far right, we've got a series of diagrams of that Great Basin area. And blue is, in essence, historical levels of fire moving through the landscape. And as you go up to red, you actually see that the likelihood of fire increases twofold. So it's twice as likely. And you can see at that bottom right-hand image in 2018, which this manuscript, that was how far the manuscript went up to in terms of analysis. You can see that there are large swaths of the Great Basin, which are now twice as likely to burn as they were in the past. And not only are they likely to burn, but you can see that it's a big area. So that means pretty impressive fires, which obviously have health consequences for people, both directly, they burn or they die in a fire, but also indirectly as these large plumes of smoke wind up being wafted over the entire United States and oftentimes up into Canada as well, which has serious health impacts. In California, for instance, this is an image from the Eros exotic annual grass data set. You can see green is good, yellow and red less good, or I guess it's not red, it's orange. You can see that much of California, in fact, is now dominated by some of these annual grasses. And you can see that some of the cover is actually quite high, 25 to 50% cover, which means there's a lot of fuel load on the ground. And fuel load leads to fires. And then not only do we have these annual grasses, which are increasing the fuel loads across California, we also have some of these ladder fuels like Scotch broom, which is becoming widespread across the landscape. And what that means is that not only do we have continuous fine fuels on the ground through large swaths of the state, but we also have ladder fuels, which will allow those fires to go from grass fire up into the canopy. And that's when we start to see some of our large, devastating fires, like the ones we've seen over the course of the last 5 to 10 years in California, where you're talking about fires that are well over 1 million acres, destroying large swaths of the environment. Now, although the West has been principally concerned with some of these issues, it's not just the West that's dealing with these issues. Of course, it's also other areas of the country. In the manuscript, we have some case studies specifically from the Southeast. Kogon grass, which is shown on the left there, is now widespread in Florida and also in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And that grass does lead to increasing fire frequency and intensity, which then has negative impacts on some of our pine woodland native ecosystems in that area. But then you've also got things like shown on the right, which is the Brazilian pepper tree, widespread in Florida, also used as an ornamental in California. And this one actually winds up suppressing fires. So again, sometimes fire is important. If we have prescribed fires that are low intensity and low frequency, they wind up maintaining the ecosystems that we're familiar with, that we're trying to preserve. So if we disrupt those fire regimes with plants like the Brazilian pepper tree, which wind up decreasing fire frequencies, that also has negative impacts on those environments, on those habitats. And those habitats are important for many human activities, including camping, hunting, fishing. As we change those habitats, we definitely have an impact on some of those human activities, which are important for human health. It's really good for people to get outside and to work, explore nature. And so, as we change things in fundamental ways, we continuously impact the ability to do that. So, we definitely highlight this in the manuscript. There are multiple management tools that are available to practitioners, some of which I demonstrated here already. So we now have a lot of mapping and prediction tools that are really helpful in monitoring the spread of some of these organisms which are affecting our wildfire regimes, as well as evaluation of efficacy of some of our management tools. We have new application, and so we discussed that in the manuscript. We have new application technologies, herbicides, and deployment strategies that provide for much better control of some of these target organisms. So, for instance, drone technologies have definitely made it a lot easier to make applications in areas that have been historically difficult to access using ground equipment. And we also have deployment strategies. And what I mean here is that some of these, for instance, some of these herbicides can be used in very specific times and very, very specific windows in concert with fire and herbivores grazing to give us really good control of some of these target invasive weeds. Rehabilitation approaches have definitely been improving over the years as we get a much better understanding of how we can rehabilitate areas. And the availability of seed has been one of the aspects of rehabilitation of habitats. Native seeds has been something that has now been highlighted as something that is important, and the availability of those seeds has been improving. And there are other technological advances as well, such as virtual fencing, which may facilitate targeted grazing. So targeted grazing often requires the movement of animals, high densities of animals moving to hit particular areas, and virtual fencing may facilitate that. That still is yet to be seen. But at a higher level, what the manuscript really also shows is that there are some these are not some of these concepts are not new, but these are concepts that definitely will help us think about how we can manage these problems on a wide scale. So, for instance, Western governors came out and had a manuscript several years ago about defending the core. This is again not a new concept, but the idea here is that we should focus our most intense efforts on conservation in intact habitats and make sure that those habitats are protected from invaders. And then on the areas that are more degraded, what we should probably be doing is accepting that those areas have changed fundamentally and that we may or may not be able to restore them to something like what they used to be. And instead, we should use integrated pest management to manage those populations so that they don't spread as widely or cause some of the significant problems that they have been causing for us here recently. And critically important is, I call it vertical integration, but that may not be quite right. The idea that we need to be including local, state, and federal entities in the discussions of how we manage these pest management issues across the landscape. It is certainly true, and Western governors has been definitely on board with this idea that it's probably not the best idea, even though Bureau of Land Management and Forestry Service manage wide swaths of the West, as well as large areas across the nation. It's really important for those efforts to be in concert with the local and state folks that also have a voice and are interested in the management of those issues. And so all of those levels need to be included when we start dealing with these problems. So that's all I have, Jill, about myself, my journey, the Western Center, as well as the upcoming CAST manuscript. Do you want me to stop sharing at this point?
I think it's happened. Matt, you and I are on the screen now, so I think we're good.
Got it. Thanks, Jill.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting topics, Matt. One of the things that comes to mind that you and I have talked about a little bit going in many different conversations is that wildfires are a big hazard in a lot of different areas, and a lot of them are, if not caused by, but are facilitated by these invasive plants. Yet when we hear the news, when we hear some of the policymakers speak about wildfires, they talk in different terms, and they really don't acknowledge the role of these invasive plants. How do we address that? Do you know why is it in your opinion, and how do we address that?
So it's certainly true that the news media can be a really effective partner for us. Where we've seen this principally for integrated pest management has been in mosquito control. So when a new disease, we saw it with West Nile, comes up, the news media really takes hold of that, and they've been really effective partners at getting some of the programs that have been essential in monitoring some of these diseases to really be effective. So, for instance, in California, the news media picked up this idea of there was this wild bird monitoring. So people could collect wild birds that had died in their gardens or in their yards, and they could send them into California Department of Public Health and get them analyzed for the disease. And this was really crucial in monitoring how that disease was spreading throughout California. West Nile is principally a bird disease, but it does spill over into human populations. And the news media was great. I mean, they did a really good job of making sure that there were a lot of articles about these programs. There were a lot of news attention focused on this. And that really helped increase the submissions of these programs. But over time, as that West Nile sort of cycled out of being, sort of the top line item in the news. Um, that that participation in those programs started to diminish. So I think it's really critical that we make sure that the news media have the information that they need so that they can really help amplify some of these issues that we think are important. And so, in the case of the weed component of the wildfires, I think it would make sense for us to figure out a better way to engage some of the media outlets. It's something that I think maybe we haven't done by virtue of the fact that they haven't been highlighting those things. Makes me think that we haven't done a very good job of maybe getting them the information that they need so that when they talk about the wildfires and the impacts associated with them, they also have the information available to them to talk about how those weeds are important. And that's, in part related to Western IPM Center efforts, but it's also, something that we should be working with the, Weed Society, the Weed Science Society of America on, as well as the Western Society of Weed Science. The scientific societies are oftentimes really great partners for us in a lot of these efforts because they have a lot of those connections. And so it's probably something that the center needs to work with the science societies on as well.
Okay, thanks. That kind of leads me kind of back to something I was thinking about, excuse me, as you were, excuse me, talking about the centers and the regional aspect. You look at the Western IPM Center, which is the center that you're the director of. Good Lord, your region starts in Alaska and goes to Hawaii. So how do you address that diversity of landscapes and issues, and how does that relate to this conversation on wildfires?
Yeah. So you're right. The West is large and diverse, and certainly a lot of the issues that we see say in the Pacific Islands, which are largely tropical or subtropical in nature, and then you compare that to issues that you're having in Alaska, which is it's not Arctic, I think it's tundra or subarctic. Those are going to be vastly different. So what we rely on principally is that IPM network. So we have coordinators, state coordinators in Alaska, also have them in Hawaii and in Guam. I don't know if we currently have anybody in Northern Marianas or some of the other Pacific Islands, but those when we get together, we talk about, okay, what are some of the issues that you folks are facing, and how do those relate to some of the issues that other folks in the region might be facing. And in so doing, what we can do is we can leverage resources in some of the better funded programs to help some of the programs that are a little further afield. And obviously, their problems are a little bit more specific. In addition, we also have an advisory committee which provides us with feedback on what our priorities should be. That advisory committee pulls both from the public and private sectors. So we get folks from government agencies, we get folks from land grant universities, we get folks from private industries, from non-governmental organizations, from from a variety of different areas. And we meet every year and talk about what the priority issues are facing the West. So, it's hard, but we do make an effort to try and make sure that, at least for the most part, all of those different voices are heard. And then a big part of how we pull some of this information from stakeholders is through our grants program. So we get grants every year from folks in the region saying this is a priority issue that we need to address. And Steve Elliott and Emma Tribble do a great job of going out and talking to those folks over the course of those projects and pulling those stories back, which then get published through our newsletter. And that's really an important way to make sure that those issues gets highlighted as well. So I think we do a pretty good job. Obviously there are still a lot of, I guess you'd say, underserved populations. So there's a lot of groups that don't necessarily submit projects to us, project proposals to us, and also don't interact with us on a routine basis. And so that's what I mean underserved by us. We don't interact with them routinely. And I think we need to do a better job of trying to make sure that we address those issues as well. And to be honest with you, I haven't really figured out a great way to do that yet. It's oftentimes something that requires a fair amount of time and attention. And so it is something that it is something that's at the forefront of our minds. But to be honest with you, I don't really have a great solution for it yet.
A constant discussion point, I'm sure. One of the things that struck me when I saw the introductory slide versus what you've been talking about is that the term pest control is used often by people, and you use the term pest management. What's the difference, and how does that relate to what the goal is for IPM and the IPM centers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I oftentimes use them interchangeably, and that's probably not quite correct. So I think control inspires the idea of it gives you a level of confidence. Like when you say you can control something, it means that you're fairly confident that whatever that thing is doing, you can change the direction of that thing. Whereas managing something means that you're more working in concert with it to see how it can be sort of adjusted to go the way of, like, for instance, I think of my children. Do I have control over my children? No, I don't think anybody could say that. But I do think that I can manage kind of how they are negotiating life by helping them understand, repercussions and consequences. So I think that control has a certain degree of hubris associated with it. Like if I say I can control something, it means I think that I can actually dictate what it does. And so management, in my mind, is a little less confident. And it inspires this idea that some level of this particular organism is acceptable, that I can deal with, this organism at some level. And so this is important when we're thinking about, say, weeds or invasive grasses on the landscape, or invasive, bushes or trees on the landscape. I at a certain point, I think it's no longer going to be uh, eradication or complete control of the thing, just getting rid of the thing whole scale, is no longer going to be possible. And so that's where we come with the integrated pest management mindset of, we're going to have to accept that they're going to be there, because we simply can't get rid of them anymore. Um, and so, what's the best way to keep that population at a level where it's not creating undue harm to folks that need to use that area for whatever they're using it for?
I agree. Some, we've in some other areas of these cast meet the experts. We've talked to people who, are doing things like some of the genetic techniques, some of the remote sensing techniques that you alluded to, and some of the, the using drones and other avenues. How do we start bridging the gap between where they're going with some of these new technologies and new understanding of biology, and how are we bringing that into our understanding, and of how do we integrate pest management? How do we do a better job?
Yeah. Well, science takes time, and oftentimes it's not. The pace of technology is pretty fast, and I think it's probably outpacing our ability to study these things in depth and really begin to understand how they work, sort of at a landscape scale. Um, so I think it's critically important that we continue to work with these technologies to really understand what's going to happen when we put them out on the landscape. And then, one of the things that I think we haven't been particularly good at, and I'm certainly guilty of this as well, and that is this idea of talking about risk. What are the risks associated with, the pest? What are the risks associated with the pest management tool? And how do we kind of gauge those two things? We do that intuitively. Oftentimes, as people, we kind of think about those two things, and we think about our, maybe our value system, or what our goals are. And so all of that comes into play as we do that, but oftentimes we can't really articulate how that all works in our minds. And so I think we need to do a much better job of really talking about risks and benefits, especially when it comes to the deployment of some of these new technologies. And then we need to continue to study how those new technologies will manifest on the landscape, to have as complete an understanding as possible of what it means when they actually wind up going out there.
Yeah, that's a really an interesting point, and I think that fits in with some of the other discussions that are going on across a lot of disciplines. Is the whole concept of sustainability, and what do you mean by pest management sustainability, and how should pest management sustainability fit into that broader idea of overall landscape and crops sustainability?
Yeah. So I know there's a lot of debate about kind of how we use the word sustainability. And there are some new terms that are also being floated out there, which in essence are synonymous, in my mind, to some extent, synonymous with sustainability. So knowing all of that, I also have my own opinion about what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability. For me, a big part of sustainability is reducing the inputs into our system, whether it's agriculture, whether it's rangeland, whether it's forestry, whatever the system happens to be. We probably want to try and reduce our inputs into managing that system. And what I mean by that is, whether we're talking about chemical inputs, whether we're talking about mechanical inputs, whether we're talking about energy inputs, whatever those inputs are, it seems to me that we should be looking at all of those and saying, okay, is this really necessary? Do we really need to be doing this? And then I think what will happen is that in the process of that analysis, and I think a lot of people talk about life cycle analysis, which tends to incorporate all these different aspects. I, I'll have to admit, I am no expert in life cycle analysis. Like, I know the term and I kind of have seen what it looks like, but could I actually do one? No, I don't think so. But it's an interesting way of thinking about sort of the whole system, the gestalt, the whole system as a, and it's not just insects, it's weeds, it's pathogens, it's the whole gamut. Just thinking about the whole system, all the inputs that go into the system, and are some of those inputs necessary, and can we actually start phasing them out? This has important economic ramifications as well, because those inputs cost money. And as we reduce those inputs, that obviously saves us a great deal of money. And it can save us some heartache too, because, um, you know, in essence, if they're not necessary, why are we throwing them at this problem? But in addition to that, I think it's important to think about not just the inputs into the system, but also how we think about the system as a whole. And that's why the integrated pest management mindset is so useful in this context, because the idea is that you're not just thinking about one aspect of the system, you're thinking about all the different aspects of the system, and then trying to manage those all in concert with all the different tools that you have available to you. And then you're doing that in the context of your own goals as well as your own value systems to figure out how you want to do this thing. And then even layered on top of that is the risks and the benefits associated with those management tools and strategies. So um, it's complicated, and that's one of the things that makes integrated pest management to some extent kind of scary for folks, because it is complicated. Managing biological systems is not straightforward, and especially if you're talking about something like weeds on in a rangeland setting, we've got a lot of different stakeholders with a lot of different sort of goals and value systems, to try and sort of do one thing that will satisfy everybody is very, very hard. And in my opinion, it's to some extent impossible. So I think we have to really be thinking about a mosaic, which the mapping systems really help us with, because we can understand kind of where we need to focus our efforts. And then getting all those groups of people together to talk about, well, here's all the things we have available to us and how are we going to deploy them. These things are just really important. And yeah, they take time. There's no question about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then I start thinking about, okay, you go out on the landscape and you've got various activities that are going on, there various priorities that are going to disturb that landscape. And then you layer in changes in our environment, changes in our weather patterns. And like in the West, we're experiencing severe drought in many areas. And areas of the East, they have the opposite problem. They're experiencing a lot of flood. And those are going to impact the environment and the potential introduction of new pests. So how do we keep up with the pests? They seem to manage to change faster than we can keep up with them. And so where do we start to do that?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm kind of a big proponent of, I think they call it horizon scanning. So looking at, not just the United States, but looking broader afield at some of the things that could be coming to us in the future. Certainly with human travel across the globe being fairly easy these days, with a lot of movement of goods and services across the globe. We see the introduction of new pests, whether they be weeds, whether they be pathogens, whether they be insects, routinely. And it's really hard to predict which ones will establish and which ones won't. But I think it's really important for us to be thinking about, like, okay, here's the horizon. What should we be worried about? And then even within, the United States, So, for instance, I think back to this one effort. I apologize, Jill. Many of my examples are bugs, but
Tell me something I haven't heard before.
yeah, I figured you would be accustomed to that. If you think of the it was called the murder hornet for a while, but then it was called
Yes.
the giant Asian hornet, I think. Anyway, um, it was introduced into Washington State, possibly from Canada, or maybe simultaneously introduced in both Washington and Canada and British Columbia. And so there were some efforts after its introduction to understand, okay, where's this thing likely to occur in the United States if it spreads, right? And those are really helpful in getting us to think about, okay, so if this thing escapes, if we don't manage to eradicate it, like where is it going to be a problem? So the horizon scanning, predicting where they're going to be a problem. These tools are really useful for us to kind of think about what kind of issues we're going to face in the future. Again, they're modeling efforts, so it's not perfect, but at least it gives us some idea.
Yeah. There's actually a question in the chat that came up. I don't know if you can see it, but we have a question that says, are there specific barriers, policy, funding, or otherwise, that prevent more widespread adoption of IPM strategies for wildfire mitigation in high-risk regions? I think you can see it at the bottom. And I think that kind of goes with a lot of the whole social versus biological aspects that we've been talking about. And so what
Yeah.
say you?
Yeah. So the barriers are numerous. So if we're talking about high risk areas, if we're talking about areas that are highly invaded, there are tools that we can use, but there are regulatory issues involved. So, for instance, the land ownership is oftentimes a question that we have to address. If it's a federal agency or if it's a private landowner, those are things that we have to consider. There's this regulatory framework for the federal government, but also, the question of what we're allowed to do on private land. So there are regulatory issues involved. Certainly, in terms of policy, I think that I kind of touched on it right at the beginning, where you have federal policies that are involved or state policies involved when we talk about, say, fire management. Those policies need to be re-examined, as well as the policies of, we should be trying to eradicate cheatgrass over the entire Great Basin area. That's probably not a great policy. It's probably not something we can achieve given the resources that we have available to us. So that feeds into the funding question. I think we have to kind of consider all of those barriers together when we start talking about what we can actually achieve on a landscape level. I think, uh, yes, with infinite funding, we could probably do a lot more, but that's just isn't the reality. So funding obviously is always going to be a barrier for us. But it's not something that we can't deal with, right? I mean, if we think about these things in the context of the Gestalt, like the environment is changing, things are changing all the time. And so I think this was at one of the Western Governors Association meetings where, it was the governor from Utah. Oh boy, I'm not going to remember his name at the time, where he basically said, look, we can't prevent all these things. You can't expect us to eradicate them all. So how should we manage this? And that's kind of the idea here too. Yeah, I mean, with infinite funding, we could probably eradicate some of the things that are problems, but would we ever be able to restore those habitats to what they were initially? I think the answer to that is probably not. So concentrating our resources, making sure that we're focused on the priorities is really important to us. So even though they're barriers, I think they can kind of help us focus our efforts on things that we really think are important. And in so doing, align with all the management goals of all the different stakeholders, as well as a variety of different, sort of value systems.
Well, and I think along with that, some of these weed problems, invasive plants, they actually change the characteristics of the soil. They change the environment around them. And so you cannot return to what it originally was because of those alterations in the physical chemical environment that they're dealing with too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this has been a really big advance for us, but it still has a lot of work to do, and that's in the area of soil science, especially with soil microbes. Characterizing those, basically those subsurface biomes, I guess. I'm not really sure exactly how you talk about the biological component of soils. Our understanding of that is I think fairly rudimentary at present, and it's definitely an area that we need to concentrate on, because you're absolutely right. As we change those microbial communities in the subsurface areas, um, in essence, that makes it much harder or possibly impossible for the plants that used to be there to reestablish. And, it's really kind of what we talk about with invasive grasses as environmental engineers. So they are changing the landscape as we speak. And we have to understand the extent of that change to really be able to understand how likely it is that we could actually reverse some of those changes.
Okay. Well, with that, Matt, I think we're going to have to close. You've escaped my most difficult question, which was, what do you recommend we do going forward? So we'll leave that one hanging for everybody to think about. And I just want to thank you so much for your time today and for sharing with us what you're doing and this new publication. We will look forward to it later this year. Thanks a lot, Matt.
I wouldn't be able to tell you anyway because it's in the publication. I don't want to ruin the punchline.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill.